The SD Ruby podcast is brought to you by New Relic.
All right, guys, I'm going to start. I'm Patrick Crowley. I'm a Rails developer and Logo Apps on Twitter. I want to talk to you guys about how to make your Rails apps roar with OS 10 Lion. First, let me give you a little bit of background. Has anyone ever used OmniGrapple? Okay, cool. So, as you might know, OmniGrapple is sort of like Visio for the Mac and also for the iPad. So it's sort of a diagramming tool. Originally, it was kind of created to build things like flowcharts, but you can use it for a lot of stuff, including designing websites, interfaces, interfaces for iPhones. This is how it looks on the iPad. And one cool feature of OmniGrapple is that it has this concept of a stencil. And so a stencil is just a file format for sharing clip art. And so when you first install OmniGrapple on your Mac or iPad, you get a lot of cool stencils for free. You can see that there's one here, which is the US, right? And so anything you see there on the right can be dragged into your document. Voila, right? And so, kind of a cool feature. So a couple years ago, I made a site called Graphitopia, which basically is an enormous library of these stencil files. So today we've got about 650 different stencils, which probably have, I don't know, tens of thousands of pieces of art you can use. And all sorts of topics. You can see on the left there, we've got a whole list of categories. It's a little hard to read on the screen here, but there are dozens of stencils for the iPhone and for Android and for general user interface design. There's maps, there's a lot of electrical engineering stuff. It's really quite cool. Here's another category, user interface. And so if you go and look at a particular stencil, this is an example of one. This is a stencil that's got some iOS elements that you could use, sort of get a head start on designing maybe an iOS app you're working on if you use OmniGrapple for that. So it's cool, a great site, but there's kind of one problem, at least for me. The problem is that I've got to approve and publish all of these stencils manually, which basically is a lot of busy work, right? So here's that same stencil. If I were going to edit this, go in and kind of approve whether or not it should be on the site. And, if I, essentially whenever a stencil would be submitted, I would go and check it out and make sure it's okay and publish it. So what's that workflow like? Okay. All right, so I get notified via email that there's a new stencil. I have to go and find an OS 10 machine, either my laptop or my desktop, which if I'm traveling may not be convenient. I might not get to it until it's the weekend. Maybe I'll get to it in a couple days or something. So once I do that, I go to the site, I download the stencil, and I open it up in OmniGrapple just to make sure that it's okay. And then I actually edit the stencil so that it's easy for me to take a screenshot of it, right? Take that screenshot, open up in Photoshop, I crop it down, save that as a PNG. Then I open up the sort of admin dashboard on Graphitopia so I can edit that stencil. And then I upload this PNG screenshot to the site. I double check it, make sure it's good. Then I actually publish it so it's visible to everyone. Then the final step is I tweet about it to 1,000 people or something. And then maybe a profit. It's just it's a lot of busy work, right? Kind of sucks. It's just like 5 or 10 minutes, but it's an annoying 5 or 10 minutes that I'd rather not do. So recently I was asking myself, what if I could automate that entire process? Both some of the admin stuff and also generating this preview of the stencil instead of taking screenshots. But if you think about it, it's kind of called Mac, right? If I'm going to do that, I actually need to have an application that's running on OS 10 in a production environment, which I'm betting most of you have not done that before, right? No, so no hands. So it's kind of a fail, right? Let's kind of walk through why it's a fail. In general, you don't still see, all the apps we build are kind of predicated on Linux-based hosting. You get some kind of Linux distro, mostly accessible to you via the command line. OS 10 itself can't be easily virtualized on Linux. I mean, there is now finally a way to virtualize it on another OS 10 machine. But you just don't really see this as a matter of course in normal web app development. There's definitely a configuration you potentially have to do if you're screwing around with the OS 10 machine. Imagine just sitting with your dev environment on your laptop. That's a pain in the ass. That can take, maybe there are 40 or 50 discrete things you're doing, you got to kind of do. And the last thing is that it's kind of pricey, right? So let's kind of walk through the price side of the fail of this equation. All right, so in terms of options for OS 10 hosting, you can kind of bring your own Mac Mini, right? And that means you essentially buy your own Mini and set it up and send it off to be co-located, or you buy a Mini from someone who already is co-locating it. You could bring your own Xserve, although that's going to be less and less common now that Apple has discontinued the Xserve. You could get a dedicated Xserve, so that's going to be probably the priciest thing. So you get the benefit of not having to sort of physically set it up in person, but it's still up there. I mean, bottom line is these things can be a lot more expensive compared to your normal Linux-based, dedicated server or VPNs. All right, so let's look at the costs specifically, right? So if you bring your own Mac Mini, here are 4 or 5 different hosts that allow you to colo a Mac Mini in their facility. So the setup fee is essentially you shipping them a Mac Mini or you buying a Mac Mini from them directly. And then, so that's going to be probably at least $600 or $700 setup charge for just getting that machine. And then you're also going to pay a monthly fee, which tends to be a lot higher than a typical Linux web host. So you can see the price ranges anywhere from $30 to $120 a month. I love how all these companies have the same name, basically. Mac Mini, Colo, Vault, World, Connect. So bring your own Xserve. Again, this is going to be less and less an option for people. But there's a company called MaxStadium that does this. So you essentially send them an Xserve, and prices for those could range between maybe $1,000 and $3,000 if you kind of find one on eBay. And then your monthly cost is going to be $150 to $500. And then lastly, there's Xserve hosting. You get a free Xserve basically, but the monthly cost is still pretty good. And to be honest, what I want to do here, these are a total overkill. I mean, more typically Xserves are used to do things like host email for an entire company or something, sort of medium-sized company, or do some internal survey or something. All right, so how do I get around this? There's actually a really cool new option that's only been around for about a month. There's a company which does not require you to buy a Mac Mini, either from them or on your own. They're just merely providing Mac Mini-based OS 10 hosting. They're called MaxStadium. They also do some of the other things I just went over, but this particular option where you're essentially renting a Mini from them is new. It's only been around for a couple of weeks. So let's look at the price points for those. So they have 3 plans. It ranges from $25 to $50 a month. The most basic one gets you a terabyte of bandwidth. You get an i5 processor, 4 gigs of RAM, a 500 gig drive running at 400 RPM. Next up from that is Pro. That's 2 terabytes, faster processor, double the RAM, dual 500 gig drives running at a much faster speed. And then the Elite plan is the same as the Pro, except you get unlimited bandwidth. which is kind of cool too. Unlimited bandwidth for 50 bucks a month. All right, so how would this work if you were going to do this, right? And I've done this, so that's why I'm kind of talking about it. Let's say you've got your existing Rails app, which you're very happy with, but there's something you want to do in OS 10 you can't do in a Linux environment. The way I would do it, at least the way I did it, is you've got the primary app on one server, right? And that's Linux, and then you've got your secondary app on the OS 10 server, and they're just going to talk to each other via really simple REST API. And literally, in the case of what I'm doing, like there are one or two methods on either side, and that's all the handshaking I have to do with this particular purpose. So I'm going to kind of talk about how you would actually do this yourself. First thing you would do would be go to MaxStadium and sign up. Choose the plan you want. Again, I got the cheaper option, mainly because of the load that I have. It's going to save me a fuckload of time, but the number of these jobs I'm doing per day actually is very tiny. It's probably half a dozen of these little jobs. So I don't have to worry too much about crazy load or something. But depending on what you do, you can kind of pick a different plan. So once you've signed up, they're going to email you basically an IP address that points to your server. They're going to give you a user account for that box, and they're going to give you the password. And then you just open up screen sharing or your favorite VNC client and put that stuff in. And then you're going to log into that box. And this is kind of what mine looks like right now. But you're going to essentially log into like stock OS 10. So the next step obviously is going to be really to configure your menu. So the first thing you're going to do is just get in there and tweak settings you need to tweak. By default, it's already pretty well set up. It's also, I should mention, they've got like a console type dashboard, so you can reboot the machine with hard reboot if you need to. But this will just be stuff you need to do to kind of set the machine up to your liking. It could be things that are really basic, or it could be just tweaks you like whenever you're working with any kind of dev environment on OS 10. Next thing would be kind of Ruby and Friends. So how are your personal preferences for that? Whether it's homebrew and then on to RVM or RPM, so on. This might really depend on your application, depending on what you're specifically trying to do. You might need a database. Maybe if you're not storing a database locally, maybe you need to interact with one remotely. So you might want to install MySQL or Postgres or whatever database you're using. And then I'd recommend, if ultimately the thing you're doing essentially is a type of background job. You're going to farm a task from the main app to the secondary app. And so using Redis or delay jobs is a good way to kind of keep track of those jobs, make sure they're done kind of sequentially, and you're aware of any failures and stuff like that. And then similarly, you might want to have some kind of monitoring tool like God or Monet just running on the machine itself to make sure that your Rails app and anything else you're doing stays up. All right, so then once your kind of core environment's set up, right, and, how can you essentially work with OS 10? Like, what are the ways your app can talk to OS 10 and use different parts of it? So first thing is Ruby, right? I mean, what I wound up doing was, if you go back to that diagram I had of the primary and secondary app, when the request comes in the secondary app, it kind of hits an action in Rails, and that action is sort of the main task that I'm doing. Essentially, it's creating a preview of a stencil, right? And so when I create a preview, there are a lot of subtasks, like all the 15 different tasks or whatever I showed you. And so what I did was just have this action kind of be the primary parent of that entire process. And then from there, actually, sometimes I would use like kind of like a fork process, and then I would use depending on what you're doing, you can use backticks or exec or system or something to shell out to the local machine and use various command line tools that normally are on OS X and other sort of Unix machines. And then a big one probably is going to be AppleScript if you intend to interact with an OS X app in particular. In my case, I specifically need to communicate with OmniGrapple, so it made a lot of sense to sort of use the standard method of doing that on OS X, which is AppleScript sort of as a front end for interacting with applications over Apple events. So, particularly with AppleScript, there are a couple sort of Ruby AppleScript bridges, Ruby OSA, Ruby AppScript, and there's actually, I discovered one that's actually a Mac Ruby fork of AppScript. I don't really recommend any of these because I think you're kind of adding an unnecessary level of abstraction. So just making things more complicated than they need to be. So what I wound up using was OSScript, which is just a command line tool in OS X that lets you, from the command line, run a specific AppleScript. Okay, so you would say like OSScript, my AppleScript file. And then separately, maybe you're going to want to go and write an AppleScript. It's going to do whatever you want. And one enormous caveat about AppleScript is, as I said on Twitter a few weeks ago, if Ruby's optimized for elegance, then AppleScript's kind of optimized for fuck you, you'll never guess the syntax it is. So it can kind of be a pain in the ass to work with. If you can, try to find pre-written scripts that do a lot of what you do and sort of modify them, or find someone who's maybe an AppleScript guru or something, but it's just a pain. And the reason for that is the sort of design goal behind AppleScript was to make it's interesting actually, because Ruby is optimized for elegance, and we spend a lot of time in Ruby and Rails, I think, writing things so that they're clear and apparent, and they do what you think they should do. And in some ways, AppleScript had the same goal, but they kind of screwed it up where they essentially tried to make it like English. Right? So you can read Ruby code, and it kind of is this pseudo-English, but it's programmatic and it's definitive, where AppleScript kind of looks like English, but the very weird, subtle things about the syntax that can really screw you up. All right, so let's see this in action. All right, so here's Graphitopia. Here's an actual stencil that's been up for a while. Just a little stencil with some blockhead people on it. So I'm going to edit this stencil, and just for a while, I'm going to change the preview of it to this goofy picture of DHH. All right, so I'm going to save this, and go look at it again, and there's DHH. This is obviously not the preview you would get. If you download the stencil, it's not going to look like this. So let's edit this and update the stencil. Okay? So I happen to have a copy of it right here. So I'm going to upload this stencil and just save the changes. And so basically, what you're seeing here, like this is the main site, the main Graphitopia site, and then my sort of secondary app that's running on OS X is over on a subdomain, jarvis.graphitopia.com. And this is just kind of a fun little welcome page I made for it. It was sort of Iron Man inspired. But if we go back to that stencil now and look at it, it's now the correct thing. And I'll do that again, and I'll actually switch to the Mac Mini so you can see what it's doing. So I'll put DHH in again.
So is this when the user uploads it?
Yes. Yeah, I'm logged in as an admin right now, but if you were to add a new stencil or edit one you've already added, it would look the same. I just have a couple more features. All right, so here's DHH. So we're going to update the stencil. And just switch really quickly once I hit save to the screen sharing app and show you what the Mac Mini is doing. So you can see it opened OmniGrapple really fast and exported the PNG and then uploaded it back to the main site. And I don't know if you can read this very well, but this kind of just breaks down the entire task in terms of all the subtasks related to generating a preview. So if we go back to Graphitopia and reload, there it is. I'll show you one more thing that's kind of cool. I'm going to quit. So I'm going to quit that app entirely. It's not running right now. And I'm going to close terminal completely. Okay. I guess it's a little laggy right now. All right, so one thing you have to also think about is sort of what's going to happen when this machine, reboots normally, or if something goes wrong. And so you need to kind of be thinking the same way you would think with any other app you're doing in production. Like what's going to happen if things go wrong? And so I basically have a script that when the machine reboots, there's certain AppleScript that does a bunch of crap to get it started again. And since I intend to kind of log into this and see what's going on to it, I'm essentially just running all this stuff in terminal, right? Which you wouldn't necessarily have to do, but it's kind of nice that it sort of kicks off the entire process. And I'm actually scripting terminal itself to open up different tabs, and right now it's tailing the production log on this app. It's also tailing delayed job, which is kind of cool. All right, so back to the presentation. All right, so one more thing I want to show you. It's kind of cool. It came out of this kind of process was the ability to kind of really upgrade the way that I get notified. So now when I get notified about a new stencil, it's got the preview already attached, and I can actually prove it from my phone. So that now essentially the notification will be the way I approve stuff. And so approving it will publish it and tweet about it. So I really won't have to be near a computer ever again to do this. So a couple caveats. Scaling is not included in this. That's kind of your own problem. It depends what you're doing. In my case, I have a fairly small load here. They're saying we're only going to do this probably a couple times a day on average. So this box is great for that. It's not going to ever be overwhelmed. But if you're going to wind up having like thousands and thousands and thousands of requests per day, perhaps we handle it on the higher end, but you just need to kind of architect that carefully. It's important to clarify this is not an OS X server, although you probably could actually run OS X server on a mini that's hosted like this. I think now OS X server is something it's an add-on we buy through the Mac App Store, where previously it was an entire separate install of OS X, but now you can just install it on top of a normal consumer-grade copy of OS X. But OS X server specifically is really designed for small work groups, or small to medium work groups, who, like I was saying, might have shared email, shared calendar, that kind of stuff. And it actually can do some web hosting, but probably would be overkill for the types of tasks that we would show to you. And the last thing is, you don't really need to do this unless you have a good use case for it. But I wanted to kind of bring it up because I think it's something kind of cool that because this specific company, MaxStadium, now offers kind of an affordable plan, particularly for sort of a hobbyist level. If you're a big company, a lot of what I said, price-wise, probably doesn't matter. But if you're just kind of working on your own side project or a little startup, maybe there's something in OS X that could be useful for you. So if there is, try doing this. But if not, you don't need to worry about it. So in summaries, you guys leveled up. You now know how you can use OS X Lion for your apps to do some cool things. So I hope you do. And let's see, are there any questions? Okay, can you use the mic for the question?
Test 1, 2, 3.
Sure.
But did you not just consider doing it in Windows? It sounds like it would have been a lot easier.
Like on a Windows server?
Yeah, just like on a Windows computer connecting it to Windows.
Well, I mean, for one, there's no OmniGrapple for Windows.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's
So
right.
it's,
I got that little detail.
It's OS 10 and iPad Linux.
Because I thought about it, I was like, no, it's for Mac.
Right.
Very good question. Thank you. Anybody else?
So, what?
It's weird. Mike's
So
still working.
you mentioned that there was some finessing that you needed to do the stencil when you open it in OmniGrapple.
Yes.
How much trial and error did you have to go through in order to make it do that automatically?
A lot. Yeah, that was pretty painful. So, I mean, first, this was just sort of like, I mean, really the way this worked was, I stumbled across MaxStadium's page just a few weeks after they launched the service. I was like, oh crap, this is actually affordable. It's kind of, could be something interesting. Because the prices I showed for the co-load mini stuff, I mean, that's come down. Like, 2 years ago, it was like $125 a month to co-load mini, which is sort of not super affordable for smaller scale stuff. So in terms of like doing this, essentially at first I had to kind of go, well, is this possible technically? Like, do I have enough of the pieces where I can really do this successfully programmatically? Can I export things properly from OmniGrapple? Does the export feature in OmniGrapple do a nice job? With every stencil versus just some of them. So there were kind of gotchas that way. And so if I let me show you something. I guess it's not there. Sorry, so basically, there's a lot of stuff that happens. So first thing that happens is Jarvis gets a request to generate a preview. Okay. So then it's like, all right, I'm on it, and it goes and downloads the file, right? So we can't do anything until we're sure the download's done. So it's kind of like a process loop where it's waiting to finish the download. Then it goes and begins to unzip the stencil, right? And one thing I found out was that sometimes OmniGrapple files have optional gzip compression, right? It's got to remove that also. Sometimes, essentially they have two formats in a way, like the file can either be a flat file where images are inlined into the file, or it can be a OS 10 style package where the file is like a plist with a directory of images, which are the images that appear in the stencil. Also to deal with the fact that there are 3 different potential formats people could submit. Maybe they shouldn't submit, but there's .gstencil, there's .gtemplate, there's .grapple. And I really only want .gstencil, and I have to kind of convert to that if possible. It also didn't help that the site has been around for 5 years, so I have the entire history of the stencil document format from version 1 through version 8. So it's got to take version 1 document and update it to version 8, right? Then it's got to export the PNG and upload that and do things like go in and remove any temp files and some other crap like that. So it was pretty crazy. So what I wound up doing was just getting it to work at a basic level. And then, it turns out I have an enormous collection of stencils that I can test it against. And so I had actually a rake task that I ran through and just tried to do all of them, right? And initially I would do like 50, and there would be some bizarre error that I hadn't thought about. I have to kind of work on. Kept going. I got up to about 200, and it turned out that like some of the process forking I had done incorrectly. And so I was creating a bunch of zombie processes, right, where every stencil preview generation task was creating like 15 zombies. And so I wound up hitting the process limits per user in OS 10. And then I'll get an error message saying, like, hey, SH is not available. Which wasn't good. But essentially, by programmatically testing all 600 plus stencils, and getting to the point where I could do them all successfully in about 90 minutes, that was kind of the ultimate sort of test to get it working. But yeah, that took a while. Any other questions?
Should you use Automator at all?
Did I use Automator?
Or could
No,
you?
no. In terms of the AppleScript side, I wrote some AppleScript of my own that worked okay. But again, I kept getting kind of screwed by the syntax. It turns out someone made a sort of shell script. It's a wrapper for an AppleScript that does exactly what I want. The code was on GitHub. That's kind of what I started with. And I tweaked their AppleScript quite a bit to do some particular things, like making sure I had a good margin around the entire stencil. So there's like a 30 pixel margin around it now, or making sure that I export things transparently. So you could use Automator, but Automator is, I think, better for just simple stuff. But it could work. I mean, it just depends what you're trying to do.
Certainly, I'd say if you have a Mac and you like used to computer on the building, it's really as good as AppleScript is bad in many ways.
What is?
Automator.
Yeah, I think it's probably as good as AppleScript will ever get. In terms of being, a sort of a drag and drop front end for AppleScript. It's got a lot of pre-built actions that are pretty cool.
So you can go a long way with recording some action in AppleScript
Right.
and then running the AppleScript as an automator action.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to deal with how the variables in AppleScript.
Right. Any other questions?
AppleScript available in Cobol?
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot.